Hello, everyone. This is Rick, and welcome to Astral Club. This episode, I'd like to discuss war, violence, and soul lessons. Before we get started, real quick, if you'd like to support this channel on Patreon, which many others have decided to do, and I'm very thankful for them, you'll get commercial free content ahead of time in advance on Sunday. There's an email where we can talk back and forth, and of course, I give you priority on comments and suggestions for other videos. And if that's something that you may be interested in, you'll find a link in the description. Next up, private lessons. If you'd like to learn to astral project, or you just want to improve your current quality or quantity of astral projections, I'd be more than glad to schedule a lesson with you. The email for more information will also be in the description. So, war, violence. How does this affect the soul's growth? How does it affect the lessons learned once the life is over and it's evaluated? This whole episode was started because I got a question from a Sullivan Clark, and he asked, if someone chooses a warrior destiny, will it affect them when they disincarnate? Now, this is a question that is near and dear to my heart. Many of you may know that I served as an officer in the U.S. Air Force in the 80s. Keep in mind that while I'm sympathetic to those who choose the role of pacifism, especially those who perform alternative service or, better yet, a role as a battlefield medic, I'm not a pacifist myself. I personally believe that there are rare instances when taking up arms is an unfortunate necessity. I understand that there are obviously and clearly going to be people who have different viewpoints. Nothing I'm going to say during this episode should be considered as an absolute refutation of their viewpoint. All I can do is offer my viewpoint that I've gained through years of thought, reading, and my experiences on the astral plane. So, this viewpoint is uniquely mine. You can adopt or discard it as you like. I was a student of history growing up as a child. While the kids were out playing, you might find me inside reading a book about World War II. That's just the kind of guy I was. So I studied the motivations and the reasons for various conflicts. World War II is an obvious example of how a war like that can affect the peoples of the world, and the lessons that can be learned even in the most awful of places, and carnage that results from wars of that magnitude. In this particular example, we have what is termed extreme Germans. You can't use certain words here on the tube. So I'm going to call them extreme Germans. I think we all know what we're talking about in World War II. These individuals, under their leader, the guy with the little mustache, could not be reasoned with. They could not be bargained with. When Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, tried to pacify, tried to negotiate with, give into the demands of this leader of Germany, all he did was feed a lion that was always hungry for more. When he allowed the Anschluss to happen, Germany and Austria became one country when Germany invaded. When the Sudetenland was invaded, Mr. Chamberlain allowed Germany to get away with it. And he even came back waving a treaty that this individual who led Germany promised he would never be bad again, and asked for other concessions. Of course, then, eventually, not that long after, the Germans just moved into the rest of Czechoslovakia. And then, September 1st, 1939, they decided to invade Poland. At that point, the course was obvious, and World War II in Europe at least started. I don't want to get into Asia. That's a whole nother ball of wax. And after all, this isn't about a history of World War II. Now, I don't think anyone, I'm rather certain that no one listening to this broadcast would like to say that, gee, if only there was more pacifists on the Allied side, everything would have been fine. If we had too many pacifists on the Allied side, and such that armies couldn't be fielded, I suggest right now, many of us who had been raised in the West and even North America might find themselves growing up in schools where a picture of a man with a small mustache was at the head of the class, and the start of each class would begin with a raising of the right hand. I think we're all happy that didn't happen, because many of the people, I would imagine, listening to this broadcast probably wouldn't be here because they were the wrong religion or the wrong race. And I think we can all agree it's great that didn't happen, because it would not have led to a superior world in any sense of the word. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with the unfortunate conclusion that at least in certain circumstances, it's better to fight and to kill than to allow evil men to do whatever they want with not only their country, but the country and the lives of others. So, at least in that instance, I would imagine that most of the people listening to this, if not all, agree that it's probably a pretty good idea that given the fact that World War II was inevitable, that at least it ended in a way that was more positive for humanity than if the Axis had been successful. Being the history nerd that I am, I would like to inject some historical background here, because I think it helps to frame humanity's thoughts about this particular subject. And there have been many thoughts on this subject, and I couldn't possibly cover any of them or all of them in one particular episode. However, if you want to go back to some of the most ancient laws, codes, commandments, I think that helps to at least set the stage for the evolving thought of violence in human society. In 1780 BCE, before the Common Era, the Code of Hammurabi was written. And many of us were exposed to this in school. We were probably exposed to the brief way of explaining this particular code as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. It sounds kind of barbaric in our ears today, but for its time, it was an effort to put together a code which would, at least theoretically, cover all classes, such that there was a given code, a given law, which a king, even an absolutist king, would have to honor or at least heavily consult before passing judgment, which, believe it or not, was a major step forward for human societies, where before that, the king, the nobles, the powerful people could apply whatever laws or whatever punishment they wanted in any particular case just because they felt like it that day. At least the code was an effort to codify, okay, if you do this harm, if you knock out this person's eye, well, then you have to have your eye knocked out. If you commit this property crime, well, you have to compensate the person with this many gold pieces or silver pieces, what have you. Next up was the Hebrew Bible and the Ten Commandments. We don't know exactly when that was or became part of Hebrew tradition, but current thought says that it happened sometime between the 16th and the 13th centuries. Religious people may have a closer date than that, but at least that's what Wikipedia has to say about the situation. And I consulted Wikipedia heavily in this case because, there's the Holy Bible and then there's the Holy Internet Bible, which of course is Wikipedia. I think most of us, if not all of us, or at least acquainted with a few of the Ten Commandments. And if we had a religious education, my guess is we can, recall some or all of them. Certainly I did, as I was brought up a Christian in the Lutheran Church. And the sixth commandment, as I recall, had quite an effect on me in that I thought about it quite a bit as I grew. And that sixth commandment is typically translated as, "Thou shalt not kill." However, that's probably not the most accurate translation, because the Hebrew word which was used was retzach. I hope I pronounced that somewhere in the ballpark. And that is, "you shall not murder." Now, the difference between killing and murder is huge. I mean, a person's dead. But in this context, the moral imperative was unlawful killing. The word retzach was never used by the Hebrews in conjunction with war, where armed combatants were fighting other armed combatants. It only occurred in times when, an unjust killing occurred or an unarmed person was killed. In combat, where, everyone has their spears and arrows and swords, that was never implied. So if you really want to look at the sixth commandment as it was written and as it was intended, it was not an injunction against all killing. It was an injunction against unlawful killing or murder. If we follow this basic thought process, and I think many people do in our societies in the world today, that whether we acknowledge it or not, we understand that we put people in prison or we punish them for murder, for the unjust killing of another. Now, if that occurs in, say, self-defense, the person who was killed attacked someone trying to rob them or trying to murder them, that the person who was attacked was justified in using the necessary force up to and including the killing of the attacker, because their right to self-defense is typically considered sacrosanct in most parts of the world. So we don't put that person who was merely defending himself or his family in jail simply because he responded with lethal force, simply because he responded by killing the individual who was intent on killing or severely harming him and his family. Certainly in war, we have similar standards. If a soldier, and I prefer that term, I used it, and it was the proper term to use during my service in the 80s. I was disappointed when the military changed it to warrior or war fighter, because that's not just a semantic difference in my mind. A soldier is one who may resort to arms to defend not only himself, but his country and his people and their allies. A warfighter always made me uncomfortable because the term seems to discard the defensive nature of what I considered a legitimate use of force. And now you've turned it into a term that seems more generic in the worst possible way, which is, oh, your job is to go and fight wars. Okay, but are these wars in defense of my people, my country, our democratic allies? Or is it for other less noble reasons? See, the term soldier says, hey, that's for defense. Warfighter, it's kind of watered it down now to a point of your job is to fight in whatever war we decree. And I'm uncomfortable with that particular definition, word, and attitude. I thought about this subject quite a bit before I became a U.S. Air Force officer, and certainly afterwards. I know that my desire was to serve and protect the people of the United States and its democratic allies. I was always very uncomfortable with the allies that we had that were authoritarian and oppressed their own people. I was very uncomfortable with that. But I like the idea of NATO, and the countries had to have a democratic basis in order to become part of that alliance. I understood, of course, that killing of any human being was suboptimal, to say the very least. However, as through my service and as I started learning more on the astral, about reincarnation, about the process that souls went through after they passed, and certainly with my experience at Astral Guide School, I learned that the motivation and the lessons learned by a soldier impacted greatly on how, let's put this in air quotes, successful the given life will prove. So these two concepts, motivation and lessons, are very important because they're very important factors about what a soldier takes away once the battle is over and their physical life is over. If their motivation was service, self-sacrifice oriented, noble in its reason to go to war as a way to protect a people, then the lessons learned veer into a very different direction. However, if a soldier allowed hatred and the love of killing to consume him, then his own judgment of himself would be especially harsh. War crimes, for instance, have no justification to them, and they are not and should not be covered under the rules of war, in that they are outside of the rules of war, and as such, you no longer have that pass that allows you to do your duty as necessary, because once you commit a war crime, what you're doing is you're killing innocents, you're killing non-combatants, you're killing perhaps prisoners of war who are protected by conventions like the Geneva Convention. And when one does that, one strays outside of that area of grace or that protective place that is normally afforded to a soldier in that circumstance. A soul who commits war crimes, who allows himself to devolve into hatred and the love for the harming and the murdering of innocents, is not only harming his victims, he is also doing severe damage to the health of his soul. If you recall from Astral Guide School number 1, the video that I entitled Forgiveness, this was my first experience at Astral Guide School, and the more and more I think about it, the more pointed it was for me. At the time, I thought it was probably going to be my toughest lesson. Turns out it wasn't, but it was a very interesting first lesson for me, based on my background and experience with history and the military, and my thinking about the application of violence in an organized way, such as in a good war, if you want to use that particular term. And in that particular experience, we were faced with a German SS officer who had been guilty of committing war crimes. And in his process of reevaluation, he learned of the true scope of the evil that he committed. And then he then chose to experience the death from a first person standpoint of each of the people who he murdered and who he ordered murdered. He had gone through all of this by the time he was presented before us. His soul had been racked. That's probably the best word I can think of. He certainly was in a very extremely disordered state when he was brought before us. He was certainly someone who understood now the full scale of the evil that he had wrought, and that he had repented. And as a form of repentance and a form of learning the scope of what he did, what better way than to suffer as his victims had suffered from a first person standpoint. In other words, he was there being killed by himself, feeling the pain and the terror and all those emotions. It was difficult to forgive such a person, but I found it within myself eventually to make peace with that type of individual, given everything that he had committed, but also the repentance that he had shown and the lessons that he ended up learning, which were extremely harsh lessons. Recently, I found myself watching a movie, Hacksaw Ridge. It's not as well known as many other movies, but it was based on a real life pacifist by the name of Desmond Doss. And in his story, he became a pacifist based on some experiences he had as a child. For instance, he almost killed his brother. And he became a devout pacifist when he enlisted after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And he didn't have to enlist. He was actually a worker in a defense plant, but he felt a sense of duty. However, once he was in basic training, he refused to even handle a weapon. And for this, he underwent court-martial proceedings. But it was eventually decided in his favor, in that he was allowed to become a battlefield medic, which is an individual who charges into battle with nothing but bandages and an awful lot of hope and some basic medical knowledge. Please don't think for a second that being a medic is an easier job. It's not. They are some of the most treasured people in any military organization. These people will often charge into areas that are under heavy fire when everyone else with a gun is hugging the ground like it was a long lost lover. He's charging forward under this winnowing fire to save people, to bandage them up as best he can and try to get them back to the rear. So being a battlefield medic is not safe in any way, shape, or form. And I would imagine in many cases it's every bit as dangerous, if not a lot more dangerous, to be in that situation. Because many of our enemies would see the Red Cross and they know this person was a medic, but many of them would disregard that. And certainly the Japanese did. They knew that if they shot a medic, that they would probably end up killing a lot more Americans because there would be no medic to help bring them back to the rear or provide basic medical advice. And so, in at least the case of the Japanese theater, having that Red Cross around your arm was in no way, shape, or form a reason for someone not to shoot at you. I know it happened in the European theater as well, but I don't think it happened to the same degree. At any rate, this Hacksaw Ridge was a place in Okinawa, which was during the invasion, the American, the Allied invasion, actually, of Okinawa. And he performed in an extraordinary way over a period of days where he saved many soldiers under intense fire. And in doing so, he ended up getting wounded himself in multiple ways. He would give up his stretcher so someone else could use it. I mean, he ended up getting the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is the single highest honor that the United States can offer someone who was in the military. So here we have a situation where, on one hand, we're confronted as humans, hopefully in a more advanced state than we were many centuries ago, but we're still faced with this question. And I don't pretend to have the last word to this. I just wanted to extend to you my thought process. Yes, we instinctively, or should at least instinctively, reject the idea of harming others, especially taking a life. However, in this case, I wanted to answer that question in the fullest way possible because I think Sullivan's question is one that perhaps we all think about at least some point in our lives, and we ponder, is there such a thing as justification for taking that extreme course of action? And if so, what is my position? And I'd like to know what your position is and what your thoughts are on the subject. These are mine. I'd love to know yours. So if you liked this video, please hit the like button. Share it with those of like minds. Subscribe if you haven't already. If you have, make sure that bell is on so you get notified when the Wednesday at 2 p.m. and the Saturday at 8:15 a.m. That's Eastern Time, United States, when those videos are published. And as I said, please leave your questions and comments. I love that stuff. And as always, this is Rick, and I will see you on the astral plane.